Grace Turner stood before Henry Walker's ranch house, the dust settling on her worn boots. Her 3-year-old daughter, Emma, clung to her faded skirt. The words he had spoken still burned between them in the Texas heat. "Your daughter needs a home, and my bed needs you." Society had already branded Grace a fallen woman, but Henry's raw honesty cut deeper than any whisper behind a church pew. Subscribe to find out if Grace will choose survival over dignity in this forbidden arrangement. Grace Turner had walked 17 miles through the merciless Texas sun, her daughter's small hand growing heavier with each step. The child's whimpers had long since faded into the kind of exhausted silence that breaks a mother's heart. When Henry Walker's ranch house finally appeared on the horizon, Grace felt her knees buckle, not from relief, but from the crushing weight of what she was about to ask of a stranger. The wooden porch stretched before them like a judgment seat, and she knew that crossing it would change everything. The door opened before she could knock, and Henry Walker filled the doorway with his broad shoulders and weathered hands. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, took in her torn dress, her daughter's pale face, and the desperation she couldn't hide. Grace had rehearsed her words during the long walk, but they crumbled in her throat when she saw how he looked at her, not with pity, but with something far more dangerous. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, ready to snap. "I heard about your situation in town," Henry said, his voice rough from years of speaking only to horses and the wind. His gaze never left her face, even when Emma peeked out from behind Grace's skirts. "Folks are saying you need a place to stay." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Grace felt her cheeks burn, knowing that the town's whispers had reached even this isolated ranch. She had hoped to escape judgment, but it seemed to follow her like a shadow. Henry stepped aside and gestured for them to enter the cool darkness of his home. The house smelled of a solitary man's life, leather and coffee. Grace hesitated on the doorstep, knowing that accepting his hospitality would come at a cost she wasn't sure she could afford. However, Emma's small hand tugged at her dress, and the child's trusting eyes reminded her that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She stepped inside, feeling his gaze on her back. The kitchen was sparse but clean, with a table that could seat 4, but which had clearly only ever been used by one person. Henry poured water from a pitcher, his movements careful and deliberate. When he handed Grace the glass, their fingers brushed and she felt a jolt of electricity, unrelated to the storm clouds gathering outside. She drank deeply, tasting the sweetness of the well water and the bitterness of her desperation. Emma clung to her mother's leg, sensing the tension crackling between the adults. "Your daughter needs a home," Henry said finally, his words measured and deliberate. Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Then he stepped closer, close enough for her to smell the soap on his skin and see the loneliness etched in the lines around his eyes. "And my bed needs you," he added in a whisper that seemed to echo in the sudden stillness of the house. The proposition hung between them like a blade, sharp, gleaming with possibility and danger. Grace felt the world tilt on its axis as Henry's words settled into the space between them. Emma had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, exhausted from their long journey, but Grace was wide awake, aware of every nuance of the moment. The farmer's proposal was not made out of cruelty or lust, but with the kind of raw honesty that comes from a man who has spent too many nights alone with his thoughts. She could see in his eyes that he understood exactly what he was asking and what she would be sacrificing. The afternoon light filtered through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Grace gently lowered Emma onto a chair. The child's small body curled instinctively into a ball. When Grace straightened up, she found Henry watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. He wasn't conventionally handsome, but there was something magnetic about his stillness and complete attention. She had grown accustomed to men looking through or past her, but Henry saw her with uncomfortable clarity. "I won't lie to you about what this would be," Henry continued, his voice steady despite the tremor Grace could see in his hands. "I'm not offering charity, and I'm not promising love, but I can promise shelter, food and protection for both of you." He paused, running a hand through his dark hair. "And I can promise that no one in this county would dare speak against you if you were my wife." The word wife hung in the air like a struck bell, reverberating with implications that neither of them fully understood. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. She had cried enough tears to fill the Rio Grande, and they had bought her nothing but salt-stained cheeks and pitying looks. Henry's offer was brutal in its practicality, but it was also the first honest thing anyone had said to her in months. The church ladies had offered prayers and judgment in equal measure. The townspeople had offered whispers and sideways glances, but Henry offered her something real and tangible, even if it was wrapped in thorns. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the question that had been burning in her chest ever since he made his proposition. Henry was a successful rancher who could have his pick of respectable women from good families. Why would he tie himself to a fallen woman with a child born out of wedlock? His answer came slowly, as if he were pulling the words from some deep well within himself. "Because I'm tired of being alone," he said simply. Grace heard an echo of her own desperate loneliness in those words. "This house is too big for one man and too quiet for any man to bear. Because when I saw you walking up that road with your daughter, I saw something I thought I'd forgotten how to desire." He stepped closer, and Grace could feel the heat radiating from his body. "And because maybe we can save each other from the lives we're living now." The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke, sending sheets of rain against the windows. Grace looked at her sleeping daughter, then back at Henry's weathered face, and felt something shift inside her chest like a key turning in a long-locked door. The choice before her was no choice at all. Really, it was survival dressed up as a decision. Necessity wearing the mask of desire. But as thunder rolled across the Texas sky, Grace Turner found herself nodding, sealing a bargain that would either damn them both or set them free. Capital sank. The morning after the storm brought a silence that felt heavier than the rain. Grace woke to find Emma already dressed and standing by the window, watching Henry feed the horses in the corral. The child's small hand was pressed against the glass, her breath fogging the pain as she whispered something Grace couldn't hear. There was something in her daughter's posture, a stillness that spoke of hope taking root, that made Grace's chest tighten with gratitude and terror. She had brought Emma here, seeking shelter. But now she wondered if she had inadvertently exposed her child to something far more dangerous. The prospect of a father, a home and a life that could be taken away as easily as they had been given. The kitchen smelled of coffee and bacon when they descended the stairs. Henry's broad back was turned to them as he worked at the stove with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to solitude. He didn't turn around when they came in, but Grace noticed the way his shoulders tensed and the slight pause in his movements. That betrayed his awareness of their presence. "Sit," he said without looking, his voice carrying the same gruff gentleness as the night before. Grace helped Emma into a chair at the worn wooden table, her fingers lingering on her daughter's shoulders as if to anchor herself to this moment of ordinary domesticity. Henry set chipped but clean plates before them, filled with more food than Grace had seen in weeks. Golden, perfect eggs, crisp bacon, and biscuits that steamed when broken open. Emma's eyes widened in wonder, but she waited, looking between Grace and Henry as if seeking permission to believe that this abundance was real. Grace felt tears threaten at her daughter's learned caution, at the way poverty had taught a 4-year-old to question every act of kindness. Henry noticed this too, his jaw tightening as he took his seat opposite them, barely touching his own plate. "Eat," he said to Emma, his voice softer now, almost tender. There's plenty more where that came from. The meal passed in careful silence, punctuated only by Emma's small sounds of pleasure and the distant bellowing of cattle. Grace found herself studying Henry's hands as he ate. They were scarred and calloused, yet gentle when he reached across to refill Emma's milk glass. These were hands that had known hard work and harder losses. Hands that had built this life from nothing and defended it against everything the frontier could throw at them. She wondered what it would feel like to have those hands touch her intentionally, rather than out of necessity. To feel them mapping the geography of her skin with the same careful attention that he gave to his land. The thought sent heat spiraling through her belly, and she forced herself to look away, focusing instead on the simple miracle of her daughter eating her fill. But even as she tried to push the image away, she could feel Henry's steady, knowing gaze on her, as if he could read her thoughts from the flush creeping up her neck. After breakfast, Henry showed them the house with the same quiet efficiency that he brought to everything else. The rooms were sparse but clean, furnished with the basics a man needed and nothing more. Grace found herself imagining how it might look with a woman's touch. Curtains at the windows, flowers on the table, and the soft sounds of family life filling the spaces between the walls. Emma ran ahead of them, her footsteps echoing in the empty rooms, and her laughter sounding so rare and precious that Grace's heart cracked open at its beauty. In what would be Emma's room, Henry knelt to show her a wooden horse he had carved. Its mane flowed in frozen motion, and its eyes were bright with painted life. "Made this for you," he started, then stopped, his throat working as if the words had got stuck. Grace understood without explanation. It had been intended for another child in a different life, before loss had hollowed him out and left him with nothing but empty rooms and unfulfilled dreams. The afternoon found them in the garden behind the house, where Henry's attempts at growing vegetables had met with mixed success. Emma chased butterflies between the rows while Grace and Henry worked side by side. Their hands occasionally brushed as they reached for the same weed. Each touch sent electricity up Grace's arm. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Grace found herself stealing glances at Henry, the way his shirt clung to his sweaty back, the furrow in his brow as he concentrated, and the unexpected gentleness with which he handled the tender plants. When Emma stumbled and scraped her knee, Henry reached her first, scooping her up with the natural ease of a man born to be a father. Grace watched him clean the wound with careful hands and felt something shift inside her chest as he distracted Emma with stories of horses in a low, soothing voice. Not just gratitude, but something deeper and more dangerous. This man could break her heart as easily as he had mended her daughter's knee. But watching him with Emma, Grace found herself willing to take that risk. As evening approached, they sat on the porch and watched the sun paint the sky with shades of gold and crimson. Emma had fallen asleep in Henry's lap. Her small body was so trusting that it made Grace's throat tighten with emotion. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with the sounds of the day drawing to a close. Crickets began their evening song. A nightbird called in the distance, and the wind whispered softly through the grass. "She's a good child," Henry said finally, his hand gentle in Emma's hair. "She deserves better than what the world has given her." Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. In the growing darkness, she could feel the weight of unspoken promises settling around them like a blanket, promises of protection, belonging, and a future that neither of them dared to name, but that they both desperately wanted. 3 weeks passed like a held breath, each day building on the last until Grace could almost forget that this wasn't her real life. She woke each morning to the sound of Henry moving through the house in his boots, a familiar rhythm that she had learned to find comforting rather than intrusive. Emma had flourished under the steady routine and abundant food, her cheeks filling out and her laughter becoming more frequent. The careful tension that had marked her since birth was disappearing from her small body. Grace watched her daughter chase chickens in the yard and felt a fierce protectiveness rise in her chest, not just for Emma, but for the fragile life they had built together. She knew the town still whispered. But here, on Henry's land and surrounded by his quiet strength and the endless sky, those whispers seemed as distant as thunder from a storm that had already passed. Grace had begun to think of the rooms as theirs, planning small improvements and imagining a future that stretched beyond mere survival. But it was the nights that undid her, when Emma slept peacefully in her small bed and Grace lay alone in the room that Henry had given her, listening to his footsteps in the hallway outside. Sometimes he paused there, and she would hold her breath, wondering if he could sense her presence through the thin wood, and if he knew how her body responded to his proximity, even when walls separated them. The marriage of convenience they had agreed to felt less convenient with each passing day. The careful distance they maintained was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. She found herself watching his hands as he worked, remembering the gentleness with which he had touched Emma's scraped knee. She wondered what those same hands would feel like on her skin. The longing was a constant ache, exacerbated by the small acts of kindness he showed her: coffee waiting when she woke up, wild flowers left on the kitchen table, and the way he listened to her, as if her words mattered more than anything else in the world. The breaking point came one Tuesday evening when Grace was washing up. Henry came up behind her to reach for something on the high shelf. His body pressed against her back for just a moment, and his warm breath tickled her neck. Grace felt her knees go weak with desire. The plate slipped from her hands and shattered against the floor in a cascade of white porcelain that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. They both knelt to clean up the pieces, their hands brushing as they reached for the same shard. When Henry's fingers closed over hers, Grace looked up to find his eyes dark with the same hunger she felt burning in her chest. For a moment, the world narrowed to that single point of contact, the warmth of his skin against hers, the deliberate slowness with which his thumb traced her knuckles. Then Emma called from the other room, and the spell was broken. They both finished cleaning up the broken pieces, breathing hard and avoiding each other's eyes. That night, Grace lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Every creak and whisper was magnified in the darkness. She could hear Henry moving restlessly in his room down the hall, and wondered if he was thinking of her as she was thinking of him, with a longing that had grown beyond mere physical attraction to something deeper and more dangerous. She thought of the way he sometimes looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, as if she were something precious and fragile that might disappear if he reached for her too quickly. The careful respect he showed her was both a gift and a torment because, while it meant he saw her as more than just a woman in need of rescue, it also meant he would never take what she was increasingly desperate to give. The marriage certificate they were going to sign was supposed to be a formality, providing legal protection for her and Emma. But Grace found herself wanting it to mean more. She wanted the promises they were about to make to be real, vows to bind them together in truth as well as in law. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Mrs. Henderson from the town arrived in a cloud of dust and righteous indignation. Her face was flushed with gossip and moral outrage. Grace watched from the kitchen window as Mrs. Henderson cornered Henry by the barn. Her hands gestured wildly as she spoke in sharp, disapproving tones that carried across the yard. Grace couldn't make out the words, but she could read the story in Henry's posture, the way his shoulders set and the careful stillness that came over him when he was controlling his temper. When Mrs. Henderson finally climbed back into her buggy and drove away, Henry stood for a long moment, staring after her, his hands clenched at his sides. Grace met him at the door. Emma clung to her skirts, fearful of adult anger as children often are. What did she want? Grace asked, though she already knew the answer, feeling a sick certainty settle in her stomach. Henry's eyes were hard when he looked at her, but she could see the pain beneath the anger. This reminder of the world's judgment had cut him deeper than he wanted to admit. "The church ladies have been talking," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "They think it's improper for you and Emma to stay here without a proper marriage. They're threatening to involve the territorial authorities. They claim I'm corrupting you." The words hung between them like a challenge, and Grace felt her anger rise to match his. She had known that this idyllic life together would not last, and that the outside world would eventually intrude on their sanctuary. But knowing it was coming didn't make it hurt any less, or make the threat to Emma's safety any easier to bear. Henry stepped closer, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "We could make it real," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "The marriage, I mean. Make it legal and proper so they can't touch you or Emma. But Grace," he said, reaching out and grazing her cheek with his fingers. "If we do this, there's no going back. I won't be able to pretend anymore that I don't want you. That this is just about providing you with shelter. Uni." The promise in his words sent heat spiraling through her, and Grace realized that the choice before her wasn't really a choice at all. It was simply the next step in a dance they had been moving towards since the moment she first knocked on his door. The wedding took place on a Thursday morning in the small church at the edge of town, with only the preacher and his wife present to witness the vows that would bind Grace Turner to Henry Walker in the eyes of God and the territorial government. Grace wore the only decent dress she owned, a blue cotton dress that had seen better days, but which still held echoes of the woman she had been before poverty and shame stripped her of her choices. Emma sat in the front pew, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes wide with the solemnity of the occasion and the new white ribbon Grace had found for her hair. The church was empty except for them. The morning light filtered through the simple windows, casting everything in shades of gold and amber. It was as if even God was blessing this union, born of necessity, but nurtured by something deeper. Grace's hands trembled as she spoke the words that would make her Henry's wife in truth, as well as in name. When he slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, he told her quietly that it was his mother's ring, saved all these years for a woman worthy of wearing it. She felt the weight of promises, both spoken and unspoken, settling around her heart. The ride back to the ranch passed in silence. Emma was dozing between them on the wagon seat, her small body warm and trusting against Grace's side. Grace found herself stealing glances at Henry, this man who was now her husband, trying to reconcile the careful distance he had maintained with the passion she had glimpsed in his eyes when he had kissed her at the altar. It had been a brief, proper, restrained kiss, but Grace had felt the tremor in his hands when they framed her face and tasted the promise of passion held carefully in check. Now as they drove through the familiar landscape of his land, their land, she corrected herself with a flutter of wonder. Grace felt the weight of anticipation settling low in her belly. Tonight would be different from all the nights that had come before, when they had lain in separate beds listening to each other breathe through the thin walls. Tonight she would share his bed, his body and his life in ways that went beyond the legal document folded carefully in her reticule. The afternoon passed in a strange suspension of normality, as if they were all waiting for something to begin. Henry worked in the barn while Grace prepared dinner. Emma played at her feet with the wooden horse that had become her most treasured possession. Grace found herself moving through the familiar motions of cooking and cleaning with heightened awareness. Every sound and sensation was magnified by the knowledge of what the evening would bring. When Henry came in for supper, his hair damp from washing at the pump, Grace felt her breath catch at the sight of him, this man who was now hers by right as well as desire. They ate in companionable silence. Emma chattered about the kitten she had found in the barn. Her innocent joy was a bright counterpoint to the tension humming between the adults. After the meal, Henry helped Emma with her letters while Grace cleaned the dishes. The domestic scene was so perfect that it made her chest ache with its beauty. This was what she had dreamed of in her darkest moments. Not just survival, but belonging. A place where she and Emma could put down roots and grow. When Emma finally fell asleep, Grace tucked her into the small bed with extra care, smoothing the covers and kissing her daughter's forehead. The child's breathing was deep and even. Her face was peaceful in the lamplight. Grace felt a fierce surge of gratitude for the man who had given them sanctuary. She found Henry waiting for her in the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee growing cold on the table. His eyes were dark with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Grace," he said, her name rough on his tongue. She could hear all the longing he had kept carefully contained for weeks in it. She moved towards him slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. When she reached out to touch his face, he took her hand in his and pressed it against his cheek. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because once we cross this line, I won't be able to pretend anymore that this is just about convenience or protection. I want you, Grace. I've wanted you since the first night you showed up at my door. And if you let me love you tonight, I'll never let you go." His words hung between them like a bridge, and Grace felt herself standing at the edge of everything she had ever wanted, but been afraid to reach for. Looking into Henry's eyes, she saw not just desire, but something deeper, an acknowledgement of her worth that was completely independent of her past mistakes or the judgments of others. He didn't see her as a fallen woman in need of rescue. He saw her as someone worthy of love, of passion, of a future built on more than just necessity. "I'm sure," she whispered, and the words felt like a prayer, a promise, a leap of faith into the unknown. When he kissed her, it was nothing like the careful kiss at the altar. This was unleashed hunger. Years of loneliness and longing poured into their connection of lips, breath, and heartbeats. Grace felt herself melting against him. Her body responded to his touch with an intensity that surprised her, as if she had been asleep for years and was only now truly waking up. His hands were gentle yet firm as they traced the curve of her waist and the line of her throat. Grace marveled at the way he touched her, as if she were something precious to be cherished rather than merely taken. They moved towards his room, their room now, with the careful deliberation of people who understood the significance of the moment they were creating. The lamplight cast everything in a warm glow, and Grace felt beautiful under Henry's gaze, desired in a way she had never experienced before. When he began to undress her, his fingers were patient with the small buttons of her dress. Grace felt tears prick her eyes at the tenderness of it all, the way he worshipped her with his hands, his eyes, and his whispered words of praise. This was nothing like the rough taking she had experienced before. Nothing like the shame and pain that had resulted in her having Emma, but left her feeling broken and used. This was love made manifest through touch, breath, and the sweet ache of two bodies joining together in perfect harmony. As Henry moved above her, his eyes never left hers. Grace felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. It was not just physical pleasure, though that was overwhelming in its intensity. It was a sense of coming home to herself, of being seen, known, and loved for exactly who she was. Afterwards, as they lay tangled together in the lamplight, Grace pressed her face against Henry's chest and felt the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. She knew that whatever came next, she would face it not alone, but as part of something whole, strong, and unbreakable.